Hi folks, we are back in the later Middle Ages, by which we mean the years between around about 1250 and around about 1500. And in this section we're going to be focusing on wider social change, so the key historical events of the time period in England, and then how that reflects on crime. To do this, I've made a timeline. I seem to be using a lot of timelines for this time period, and that's really because it's rather a weird and not so wonderful period of time, really. There's a lot going on, and a lot of it is quite disparate and doesn't fit into a recognisable pattern or process. So as you're looking for those themes of change and continuity, and also as you're looking out for those links between society, what's going on in society, and what's going on with crime, I thought it might help if we imposed a bit of chronological order. So that's the reason for that. And here we go. So the first event to flag up to you is the establishment of Parliament in the later 1200s. Now, Parliament isn't new. It's existed in the form of great councils since the Magna Carta of 1215. However, Edward I really establishes it as a lawful institution because he believes it will unite his kingdom. It's worth saying that Parliament is not democratic. It's basically a collection of rich and powerful lords who would quite like a say in how the law is made. Thank you very much. So that's the first event. Throughout this time period, there are sometimes periods of bad weather and therefore crop failure. Some dead crops. And this leads to food shortages and therefore famine. So there's one of those, for example, in the years 1315 to 1316. Not as disruptive as what happens in the mid-1300s when sailing ships coming from the east bring back with them a new, very deadly, very contagious disease that very quickly sweeps across all of Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. The disease is the plague, and this event is known as the Black Death. Historians reckon that while it was at its peak between 1348 and 1351 in England, it kills approximately 3.5 million people. And although we're not quite sure of the population of England at the time, that's calculated to be between a third and a half of everybody. So this was an appallingly disruptive event. We know that it was caused by the fleas on rats. People at the time didn't. Some of them believed it heralded the end of the world, so it's very scary. The plague is a very painful disease, so people were dying in agony. And then you've just got the problem of massive numbers of deaths. So, for example, after the plague, up to half of the people have been killed. So there's actually a shortage of workers, and this changes the balance of power between the rich and the poor very, very slightly, because the rich need the poor who are left to work for them. And later on in the century, some of those poor workers begin to rebel against the king in 1381. This is known as the Peasants' Revolt. And to be honest, it doesn't make much difference. The leader of the revolt, whose name is Wat Tyler, is killed, and the rebellion is suppressed, and nothing much changes on the back of it, because really the threat to law and order in this time period does not come from the poor. They can't do very much. The threat to law and order in this time period comes from those rich and powerful nobles who aren't always prepared to accept the authority of the king and don't necessarily want to follow his laws. And this is exacerbated by a series of weak kings. So I've chosen three here to talk about. We have Edward II, he's actually the son of Edward I down there, who is king from 1307 to 1327 until he is removed from the throne, imprisoned and mysteriously murdered, possibly very horribly with a red-hot poker. We then have Richard II, who is king from 1377 to 1399, when he is removed from the throne, imprisoned and mysteriously killed, possibly by starvation. And then we have Henry VI, who is king from 1422 to 1461. He does pop up again very briefly in 1470 and rules for a year before he is removed from the throne, imprisoned, and then mysteriously murdered. So you can see what all these men have in common. They're all considered to be weak or bad kings. And in fairness, in some cases there are legitimate reasons for this. I mean, poor Henry VI was only 1 when he became king, so by the time he was an adult, all the powerful lords in his court had already got very, very used to having a lot of power. Apparently he had several nervous breakdowns as king. But the problem with a weak king is that they can't enforce the law very well. And certainly when it's rich and powerful people who are breaking it, they can't necessarily always punish them because they need their support. There's also a bit of a backlash afterwards, because when a strong king takes over again, they then have to work very hard to sort of re-establish this control of the throne after it's been lost. In the 1300s through to the 1400s, there is also a bit of a movement challenging the authority of the Catholic Church, and people are asking questions about it and criticising its beliefs and the way that it runs and suggesting alternative ideas. And the Church doesn't like this. It's a challenge to their authority. This group is known as, or the biggest one of these groups is known as the Lollards. So they're there presenting a problem. The final event that I'd like to flag up to you from this time period actually begins in the reign of Henry VI. And it occurs when powerful nobles from the House of Lancaster, which is represented by a red rose, and powerful nobles from the House of York begin to fight each other, essentially over who should have the most power and ultimately who should be king. So again, we're seeing death and disruption and collections of armed men roaming around the country and fighting each other. And this lasts from 1455 to 1485 and is known as the War of the Roses. So that's a very brief summary of the time period. We're now going to think about what this means for crime. And one of the things that historians have established when they look at crime figures and at crime records is that crime tends to spike in times of hardship. So when we look at the figures, for example, from 1300 to 1400, one of the things that we see is that there's actually a lot of murders. There's 12 per 100,000 people, and that's maybe 5 or 6 times what it is in England today. So why is the murder rate so high? Well, there's a number of reasons, as I draw this chalk outline on the floor. And one of them is just that people lived very close together. Often they lived in tight-knit villages. They would have to see each other every day. And as if that wasn't enough, they would then be working on little strips of land next to each other. And under those circumstances, the potential for arguments is quite high. So when historians have looked at the court records from this time period, one of the things that we can see is that over 50% of all murders start with a simple row. It's more of a problem because a lot of people work in farming, which means that they walk around a lot carrying very heavy and sharp tools. So arguments can very quickly get nasty. There's also a problem with medical care. Obviously, they don't have very good medical care, and as a result, if anyone gets a wound, then that could get infected and possibly cause death later on. Finally, there isn't a very good understanding of mental health issues, and the murder figures from the time actually include suicide because that was seen as the unlawful killing of the self by people at the time. Also, you read about sometimes people going into what they call a frenzy and murdering people on the back of that as well. So for all these reasons, the murder rate is quite high. Actually, crimes against the person in this time period, as far as we can tell, are at about 18%, whereas crimes against property are at about 73%. Crime rises after the 1315-16 famine, for example. It also rises at harvest time because people are farmers and harvest time is very busy. They're quite often under a lot of pressure and very stressed then. Now there's also a problem with, in the 1300s, with these. And insofar as I can only ever draw cute cartoon people, I've tried to make these look really scary and threatening, because they were. These are outlaw gangs. And remember, outlaws are people who've run away from the consequences of their crime. There's two really interesting case studies of these from the 1320s, if you get the chance to look them up. One is the Cotterell Gang, which was operating in Nottinghamshire, in and around Nottinghamshire, in the 1320s. And the other is the Folville Gang. It's around about this time as well that these legends about an outlaw called Robin Hood start to spring up. Sorry, the Folville Gang is from Leicestershire, which is a really hard word to write while you're talking, so bear with me. We've got Leicestershire, there we go. And so these legends of Robin Hood are built up. When we look at the Cotterell Gang and the Folville Gang, however, they are not much like Robin Hood. For one thing, they are accused of, and in some cases convicted of, crimes such as murder and rape and extortion and kidnapping. They were sometimes led by richer people. So the Folville Gang, for example, is led by the 6 Folville brothers, and they are the sons of a knight. So they would have been familiar with weapons, but they would have also been a bit more privileged than your ordinary person. Sometimes they were supported by powerful men. Apparently the Sheriff of Nottingham actually supported the Cotterell Gang. So sometimes they had these powerful supporters, sheriffs and constables, who should have been stopping them, but instead were in some cases protecting them. And another thing to say about both these gangs is that both of them have examples where people are convicted of a crime, but then were pardoned in return for promising to fight in the King's army. So they're quite an interesting case study of some of the problems that are coming up with outlaw gangs. There's actually a problem with gangs throughout the 1300s and 1400s, and there are stories about them murdering shepherds in the fields for their clothes. They target the church a lot because the church has a lot of wealth and isn't very well protected. They often had a churchman in them as well, and that's because churchmen could write, which is handy for your ransom notes and your extortion letters. Things get much worse at the end of the 1400s, though, because of the War of the Roses, because some nobles and lords respond to the disruption by building up their own armies of retainers. And these gave them the power. It meant they could rule their areas, really. They could have feuds with each other and fight battles. They could operate on a system of strong favouritism, and in some cases they could also treat the people around them very, very badly without much fear of comeback, because there was nobody with the authority to stop them. So that's an additional problem as well. We'll have a look at how England responds to this in the next section, but that's society and crime in the later Middle Ages. See you later.